hello and welcome, and welcome to our guest, Dr. Tracy Vaillancourt. So, as you can see, in our little flyer here, she's on the Canada Research Chair in Children's Mental Health and Violence Prevention. She's got a background in physiology, in psychology, specifically sports psychology, and I know we were just chatting. So she also dabbles in neuroscience and in coaching, in soccer. She's a professor at the University of Ottawa, and I probably missed out a few other things. She's done a ton of work, even recent work, which I reviewed over the last couple of days, looking into some of the effects of COVID and the lockdowns and restrictions and closures of school on children's mental health, and hopefully we can chat a bit about that and maybe how that applies to soccer as well. As we know, I mean, this is a really relevant topic because we're in the middle of another lockdown as we speak here in Ontario. So Dr. Vaillancourt, welcome. Thank you very much for taking the time to speak with us here, and maybe I'll let you give a little brief introduction to yourself before we get going.
I think you covered it well. Exactly. So I coach also for Ontario. I'm a provincial coach, and I've coached for many, many years. And I primarily coach girls, but in the past I've also coached boys, and I've coached from 7-year-olds to adult women. And so really excited to be here with you. I'm very familiar with the good work that you do, and I look forward to our conversation.
Right on, great. So I figured I would kick things off. I mentioned it briefly about some of your recent research, which looked into sort of the effects the effects on mental health of children, but even just sort of what's been happening with kids and their parents and everything during the previous lockdowns. So I thought maybe if you wanted to explain a little bit of that research, and perhaps then, how do you see that it relates to, let's say, youth soccer in particular, because that's, our audience of soccer coaches here. So.
And I would say it actually relates to all sports, not just soccer. So I've been up since 6 doing interviews about this today. So I've done the rounds, and this is going to complete my day spending it with you. But basically what we know from writing a really comprehensive report on children in schools for the Royal Society of Canada, and I'm chairing their COVID-19 task force. So I'm privileged of working with the best scientists in Canada from all different walks of science and life. So we wrote this comprehensive report, and I'm now updating it for another publication, and the data are showing really poor outcomes for kids. So we can look at every domain of functioning. So I'll focus on mental health first. They're more depressed and they're more anxious than they were before the pandemic. And before the pandemic, it was a crisis. So we had 1 in 5 Canadian children meeting diagnostic criteria for mental disorder. Since the pandemic, we've seen increases also in eating disorders. Eating disorders are off the charts in terms of the prevalence rates right now. We've never seen this many rates. So new diagnoses and remissions. And we're seeing more difficulties with loneliness, self-esteem, all of that makes sense, right? They're alone a lot of times and socially isolated. It's affecting their academic achievement. So there's a learning loss. And the unfortunate thing about the learning loss and the mental health issues is that kids that were vulnerable before the pandemic are becoming even more vulnerable. So you're seeing an even bigger achievement gap. And then when we think about physical health, we've never had kids be more sedentary. So they're on screens more than they should be. They're not moving around. This has an effect on mental health. This has an effect on academic achievement. Richard, you have a background in physiology. So when I say that exercise improves neurogenesis and angiogenesis, you know exactly what I'm saying. And for those who don't have a background, what we're saying is that the connections in the brain just aren't as quick and they're not as rich. And, so that obviously is going to affect learning. We know that one of the best things to protect teenagers from depression is physical activity. And we just shut down soccer again for a month. I'm just so frustrated by this. And I put out a tweet like an hour ago, and it seems like it's picking up a lot of traction where, I've been advocating for kids and to open schools, but I should also be advocating to have them return to sports. And I will be, by the way. I've done it
Great.
in the past, and I'll pick up that thread now.
Well, yeah, that's awesome. Thank you so much, of course, for your work and bringing attention, to this this problem. And I mean, it's funny. I had on my list of like things I wanted to ask you about was, what are your recommendations for sport? And it sounds like it's pretty clear. Like there's so much evidence, scientific evidence from a variety of fields, as you talked about, whether it's let's say mental health, even just neuroscience, physiology, just kids' physical health, and the connections between those. So much evidence in support of the argument to reopen school and to reopen sport. And I guess maybe does it make sense at all? To keep schools and sports closed? Is there any, like even just playing devil's advocate, is there any reason now, after 2 years into this thing, maybe we don't want to go down that hole too much in this conversation, but like, what's the counter argument? Like, what's the purpose of locking down again? Yeah.
Well, the purpose is to reduce the spread of the virus, right? Which is very, very contagious right now. I've never known so many people who have COVID. Yeah. Many of my students have COVID. Many of the kids that I coach have COVID. It's incredible how present Omicron is right now in the community. So I do agree with school closures at this point and sports closure at this point, but I don't want it to be long, because honestly, like, it's just taken off too great. And when it's not going to affect kids, but kids are going to be attached to adults who may be more vulnerable. And it might actually affect a few kids, but in general, we're worried about protecting society on a whole. But our past closures have not made sense to me. And so what I think happened is that we had a panic. We were not prepared for this pandemic. And so we just kind of were shooting in the dark and hoping that we were going to hit something on our attempts. And looking back at what we've done is just appalling, because we cause so much harm to kids.
Yeah, and it's almost as if you could make the argument that all of the negative effects of the lockdowns and closures of sports and school and everything perhaps could even outweigh the negative effects that we would have seen if we had reopened earlier, and whether that's infections and even death. I mean, I hate to say it that way, but it's, if you've got depression, and that can lead to suicide, and other even long-term problems as well, long-term health problems that maybe cut short people's lives as well. So again, it's hard to quantify maybe, but yeah.
And that's the thing, is that like, we're always making a risk benefit analysis, right? Yeah. And so, but when it comes to kids, what we tend to think, and when I say kids, everybody's a kid to me who's under 18. So also adolescents. When it comes to young people, what we know is that we have this inherent belief that they're resilient. And so I think because we hold this viewpoint, we haven't put a lot of focus on them, and we kept thinking they're going to bounce back. But we might be on the cusp of a generational catastrophe, because we are wrong in thinking that all kids are resilient. Some kids will be resilient, but a lot of them won't. And the ones who were vulnerable before the pandemic will continue to be vulnerable and may not recover.
Yeah, that's a fair point. And I can ask you, I don't know if this came up in your research, but I can tell you, I mean, anecdotally anyway, I've got a business. We have, hundreds of athletes coming in and out of here all the time. And I've spoken to many different people from many different soccer clubs, and the participation numbers are down. Yeah. In the house league, in the rep leagues, and all that. And we don't know if that's permanent or not. But I mean, did you study that at all, or do you have any?
I didn't study it per se, but I predicted it would happen based on my knowledge, right? So like, my idea was informed by having read the literature on dropout in sports, and who drops out and why they drop out. So we've seen girls around age 15 disproportionately dropping out compared to boys. That was always a vulnerable age group. And if we can keep them in past 15, we can typically keep them in for life. And we're not saying that we want to keep as many participants for our own good. It's for their good. I mean, playing soccer helps you self-regulate. It keeps you physically active. It's good for your cardiovascular health. It's good for your brain health, all of those other things that come from playing sports. Anyhow, the point is if we could keep girls in, and I'll just speak to girls in particular, past the age of 15, we could typically keep them in for life. Like, I'm still playing soccer and I haven't, I'm walking while I do it, but still, I'm still playing.
Thank you for watching this short preview video from the National Soccer Coaches Association of Canada. To see the full video, plus have access to hundreds of other coaching videos, blogs, webinars, and podcasts, plus free and discounted coach education courses and other soccer merchandise, plus to have exclusive access to register for all future NSCAC conventions, both live and online, click on the link below to become a member of the NSCAC today. Also, please remember to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel, as your continued support allows us to continue to provide coach education and coach development resources to soccer coaches across Canada and worldwide. Thank you again for your continued support, and we look forward to seeing you at future NSCAC events.